Please pray with me. Lord, open our hearts and minds as we hear your word today, as we journey with Jesus into the holy city. Grant that we may receive what you say to us today with a sense of joy and excitement, enthusiasm, and expectation. Grant always that the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts would be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. When was the last time you participated in a parade? Either walking, marching, riding, or simply by being a bystander. For some of you, it was probably yesterday. Yesterday, there was a parade in Berlin to celebrate the opening day of the local Little League. And that was just the beginning of a day-long celebration of the coolest town anywhere to be found. But there are many parades that take place over the course of the year. In neighboring Ocean City, for example. The next one on the calendar is the Council of Baltimore Ravens Roost Parade, end of May. Just 3 weeks after that, the firefighters from across the state descend on Ocean City, and they have a parade on a Wednesday, June 18th. And then on a day we must never forget, 9/11, a 9/11 parade of brothers, a motorcycle ride and a memorial service in remembrance of all who lost their lives on September 11, 2001. And then come the first week of Christmas, of course, a Christmas parade. And then, several months later, a parade in which some of you participated a little less than a month ago, marking St. Patrick's Day. Now, we all have our preferences when it comes to a parade. Some of us prefer floats. Some of us prefer marching bands. Some of us prefer commercial or church entries. Some of us prefer fire, ambulance, and EMS apparatus from across the area. In my own lifetime, there were a couple of parades I have looked forward to on an annual basis in different seasons of life. In my childhood, a fireman's carnival parade in June, shortly after school had ended for the summer. And for a season when I was serving as pastor of Northeast United Methodist Church, yes, that's the name of the town and the church, Northeast, in Cecil County, all Linda and I and family needed to do was to step out onto our front porch and watch the Cecil County Christmas parade, first Saturday of December, beginning at around 11 a.m. But today we are privileged to journey with Jesus into the holy city of Jerusalem. And though we may look forward to a parade on an annual basis, a particular parade, whatever that might be, God's people had been looking forward to this particular parade, not just for the last 365 days or 1 year. They had been anxiously anticipating this particular parade, this Palm Sunday parade, for centuries. For it was 500 years earlier that the prophet of the Old Testament, the prophet Zechariah, proclaimed that a king would come riding into the holy city in a particular way. And it is noteworthy that while all eyes are on Jesus in the Palm Sunday parade, people failed to notice what the prophet had proclaimed 5 centuries earlier. They failed to notice the significance of the animal that Jesus was riding. Jesus was riding a donkey. And Jesus was riding a donkey because he had already dispatched two of his 12 first followers into the village ahead and instructed them to obtain the use of a donkey and a colt with the donkey. They were to untie those animals and to bring them back. And Jesus, in advance, anticipated the anxiety, the fear, the curiosity, and the suspicion of the owners of those animals and any other eyewitnesses to their borrowing a donkey and a colt. Jesus said, if they ask you why you're doing this, simply say the Lord has need of them. And that will satisfy their curiosity and even their suspicion that you're borrowing these animals. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't recall often seeing people ride donkeys, except for that annual occurrence in my high school years when donkeys were rented by our school and brought into the school gym, and the varsity basketball team would suit up and saddle up on the one side, and the faculty, the teachers and administration would suit up and saddle up on the other side, and they would engage in a donkey basketball game for fun and for fundraising to raise some much needed money for, let's say, the local athletic boosters in our high school. But for the most part, we have become accustomed to people raising horses instead of donkeys. In fact, two young ladies with whom I've been acquainted through their high school years, when they graduated from high school, they went off to college to study equestrian science. The science of breeding, raising, training, and showing horses. One of those two young ladies happens to be a PK. We know what PKs are. They're preacher's kids. And this particular preacher's kid went off to one of our United Methodist-related institutions of higher learning, Centenary College in New Jersey. And earlier in the morning, someone said to me that her daughter had also attended that same college for the same major, equestrian science. We don't typically think of persons riding donkeys, but rather horses. And that was the popular appraisal and the expectation of Jesus. But they failed to notice that he was riding a donkey, which meant that he had come in the pursuit of peace. For if instead he had chosen to ride a stallion or war horse, he would have come preparing to wage war. He would have come not as a king pursuing peace, but as a king who sought to wage war and to conquer and overcome the oppressive power of Rome. God's people had been oppressed before and after this generation in which Jesus came, lived, and walked among human beings, and now processed into Jerusalem in the Palm Sunday parade. Jesus had come to call into question the popular opinion and the popular appraisal of what many thought he had come to be and to do. Jesus would certainly face humiliation after this, for very shortly the cheers of persons who were shouting Hosanna, those cheers would turn to jeers. On the day of this Palm Sunday parade, as Jesus processed into Jerusalem to the cheers of the people, the word that they shouted, Hosanna, had become more of a word of praise, probably, but prior to that, it had been more of a prayer. A plea for deliverance. A prayer that can be literally translated as, save us, Lord, save us now. Save us from the oppression that we are living and groaning under save us, and usher in a whole new kind of kingdom. On a gloomy night, the rain began to pour, and it intensified so that visibility was very poor. And a lady was out driving and suddenly, unable to see the center line and the boundaries of the roadway, she simply decided that she would follow the taillights in front of her. For those taillights seemed to be headed in the direction that she thought she needed to travel to reach her destination. And so she began following those taillights in front of her, and suddenly she was startled when those taillights in front of her came to a complete and sudden stop. And then in the next split second, the lights went out. The tail lights went out completely. And here she is in the darkness with the car in front of her having suddenly stopped. And she is becoming concerned about the possibility and the potential of being rear-ended on that roadway. And not knowing what to do, she sat there for a moment, and she was startled to realize that the driver of the car in front of her had come around and was knocking on her window, beckoning her to lower her own car window. And she did, and she began to give the driver of that car in front of her a tongue lashing. She said, "How dare you stop right in front of me without any warning? And even after that, how dare you turn off your lights so that I can't see anything but a bare image of your vehicle in front of me? What is wrong with you?" And the man who'd been driving the other car said, "Ma'am, I was about to ask you the same thing. For in fact, we are sitting in my driveway, not on some roadway of your imagination." We sometimes follow the wrong kind of leader. We sometimes have a popular appraisal of the kind of leadership we think we need, rather than the kind of leadership that Jesus came to offer. Not that of a conquering king, but that of a humble servant who came to offer himself, his life, all that he had, to all the people in that Palm Sunday parade. But sad to say, the cheers would quickly turn to jeers, and they would subject him to humiliation. First, he would be subjected to the humiliation of betrayal by one of his first followers. And then he would be further subjected to the humiliation of the rejection of the crowd. The crowd who had cheered him just a few days earlier would reject him, and would reject him and condemn him to death instead of a condemned criminal named Barabbas, whose name meant Son of the Father. The man Barabbas, whose other name was also, ironically, Jesus. Jesus, who had come to save people, but not from their sin, but from that same sort of political oppression about which they were primarily concerned in Jesus' day, the day of Jesus of Nazareth. They would further humiliate Jesus by placing him upon a cruel cross. But before they did so, Jesus would gather with his first followers in a special place, in sacred space, to share a holy meal and to give thanks for all that God had done for them and for all that God would yet do in and through them in the future that God was unfolding before them. And on that day when Christ was placed upon a cruel cross, that would be the ultimate act of humiliation. And yet, as Jesus reminded them before and after, it was on that cross upon which his name would be lifted above every name, so that at his name the name of King Jesus, every knee should bow and every tongue confess that he is God, to God's eternal glory. And then after the cruel cross, he was placed in a barred tomb, a tomb that, like the donkey and colt ridden into Jerusalem on the Palm Sunday parade, a tomb that had never before been used. And then, after a long night and day of Jesus being placed in that barred tomb, the disciples dared to journey back to that tomb, knowing that the stone had sealed that tomb forever. But then they were startled to discover that the tomb was empty. And the fact that the tomb was empty excited them. And then they knew that Easter was a reality, not just merely a dream. Jesus had fulfilled all that he had come to do in his life, in his death, and in his promised resurrection. So may we choose carefully our leader, the leader who will lead us forward into God's primary plan and purpose for each of us, to love him and to serve him because he has first loved and served us. Thanks be to God who reigns forever in the person and promise of King Jesus. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen.